Newsfirst, Newsline.
Hello there, a very good evening and welcome to another edition of Newsline. We're coming to you live and direct from our Newsfirst studios here in Colombo. Much has been spoken about of the IMF agreement, about the economic situation in Sri Lanka. I believe our viewers are more updated now than they have ever been regarding the economy of Sri Lanka, how the economy functions and how we are going to move forward in the future. But to add a bit more to your knowledge, we've got with us, of course, an expert in the field of economics. He's none other than Talal Rafi, an economist at the Deloitte Economics Institute. Thank you very much, Talal, for taking time off your busy schedule and joining us.
Thanks.
Talal, there is mixed feelings, of course, in Sri Lanka, among the general population, among the political actors in Sri Lanka about this IMF program. But we didn't go to IMF by choice. It was a matter of last resort. We had nowhere else to turn to, and we had to turn to the IMF. And because of that, and because of the circumstances in which the IMF agreement was entered into, and now it's going to be put into Parliament and passed, the lack of mandate or public support is a huge issue. And we can see members of the opposition, opposing political parties coming out and saying, look here, this agreement does not have the people's mandate, and once we come into power, we will change it. Can this be done?
First of all, thank you very much for having me on the show. So I'll answer the question of whether we have an alternative to the IMF. The truth is we don't have an alternative. Because
not in your wildest imagination, nada.
With the current situation, that's what I can speak of. I don't think so. Because because a few things have to be clarified. One is, a lot of people argue that it's just $2.9 billion over 4 years. But that is not exactly the case, because once you have the IMF is more like a verification. I would even say more like being audited by a big four, like a KPMG or a Deloitte or something. So it brings in the trustworthiness. So only when the IMF approves will the World Bank and the ADB and others try to help us.
Right.
And the second thing is also, the important thing is our debt is at 128% of GDP, public debt. So without the IMF, nobody is going to go into a debt restructuring thing. So there are people who say that, we can go to a country such as China or Japan. But you see, China cannot really make the others agree. No one country can do that because of the geopolitics. Nor the US, nor China, nor Japan. But the only institution in the world which has the clout, which has the mandate to do this is the IMF. Even China is a member of the IMF. Japan is a member. India, US. So the only organization which everybody will trust, the ISP holders, everyone, is the IMF. Because it's not just the money, it's also that they're going to do a diagnostic. So they understand that what's going on, and the path they are putting forward, the reforms, are probably the right thing. It's going to be the toughest. But let me also clarify that the IMF program, we have already passed through all the toughest measures. So people say that next 4 years are going to be tough. But as a nation, without going through the IMF, we already did the tax increases. We already did the cost reflective pricing, the monetary tightening, where we had very high interest rates. So these things are tough. So the coming things would be easier, though the pain from the initial reforms will still go in. But it's going to be a gradual process. But at the same time, you see, the IMF program, it's something that if we can do it successfully, it's not just about the program. If we can do the reforms, I mean, even without the IMF reforms, I mean, most of these proposals in the IMF thing for the reforms, they've already been spoken about many economists. I mean, even I myself have given a talk on these. So these are just so we have an opportunity to either take the path of countries such as Argentina, repeatedly go, or we can do the correct reforms and come out as a developed nation in the end.
So Talal, you said that we've already done several of the major recommendations in the IMF program, but now, and you said that we need to complete this successfully, of course, that goes without saying. However, Sri Lanka has gone to the IMF 16 times before, and 16 times we have failed. 16 times, Talal. So please excuse my skepticism, but why do you think this time is going to be any different?
So just to add to that, we've gone 16 times, I admit that. But when we never went as a bankrupt nation. So we always went for balance of payments crisis. So we just couldn't import. We go to a program when things are, have to be politically, the elected party has to get re-elected. We just dump the IMF, go forward. And the IMF or other organizations also did not have an opportunity to really force us. But here it's different because not just that we are going as a bankrupt nation, but there is another important factor. Right now, countries such as China, India and Japan mostly, these are the largest bilaterals, they have lent to us. They have agreed to sort of given financial assurances and sort of debt restructuring, though I would use the word reprofiling in most cases. But still, countries such as China, Japan, India are taking a loss. Other than Japan, China and India are still developing countries. I mean, they're not as, their GDP per capita is not as high as the US. So it's still taxpayer money. It's Indian taxpayer money. It's Chinese taxpayer money. It's Japanese taxpayer money. So if they are going to take a cut, there will be pressure from these bilaterals to also stick to it. Because another thing is, of course, we are a sovereign nation and we can walk out of the IMF deal. But then like the governor and everybody says, this is our last chance. After that, no country is ever going to come forward and trust us. Even if the IMF says, if we just walk out of this one, because even when, because even the ISP holders, some of them, it's pension funds. So there are a lot of people taking a hit.
Right.
So that is my take. So that also comes to the argument that some of them say our taxpayer money is going, or our institution. So how about domestic debt restructuring? So, I mean, they have a point, but at the same time, too much into this area can sort of affect our financial stability at the same time. Right.
Talal, also recently, a court in the US took, made known a decision on an application made on behalf of Sri Lanka in response to a suit filed by the Hamilton Reserve Bank to dismiss a case that has been filed. Many say that this is going to have a blow on Sri Lanka's debt restructuring talks. How do you think this will affect it?
So, I mean, it is going to have an effect. But at the same time, like the governor was saying, we are in talks with other ISP holders. So hopefully we'll have to see how that plays out. Because one thing happened in Argentina, it took a number of years to develop. But I mean, the court has just dismissed our thing. So the case is still going on. So we'll have to see how that ends.
Right. Also, Talal, something that really caused a stir, at least among certain politicians, not too many, but still a few, was the Central Bank Act that was presented. There were petitions filed against it. However, the Supreme Court has made known their determination to the Speaker. And according to the Speaker, none of the clauses are inconsistent with the Constitution. However, the entire idea of having an independent central bank has been criticized by certain economists. Dr. Howard, for example, speaking on one of our own shows, Face the Nation, was highly critical about this. He spoke about a country that is now being run by elected officials, albeit with questionable records, instead being run by the rich and powerful, unbeknownst to the people of the nation. How would you respond to this?
So to answer that, first of all, the governor, the deputy governor, the monetary board, the governing board, all are going to be put forward by the finance minister. So unless, of course, even if you don't, so it's basically people recommended by the finance minister. So I don't see the argument. So even if you don't have the act, so the finance minister is anyway going to appoint them. So the whole idea about independence is so that the way the institutions are run can be independent. The ownership will still be, the owner will still be the Sri Lankan government. And the need for an independent central bank, I'll just give a context about Sri Lanka. You see, for 75 years, we have been running fiscal deficits.
Right.
That is like in layman's language, like if a family earns 100,000 rupees, you spend 180,000 rupees. So that 80,000 is a deficit. So for 75 years, we've been running deficits. That's how horrible the financial management of governments is, starting from the first Prime Minister, D.S. Senanayake. So what gets interesting is that even a primary budget surplus, that is, even if you take away interest payments, still for 71 years out of 75, we run a primary budget deficit. So this is mostly due to, one is borrowing heavily from outside or from the state banks. Second is monetary financing. So the central bank...
Money printing.
Yeah, money printing, to be in layman's word. So the thing is, like, why would any politician try to...
change it?
Yes, try to balance the government spending when he can just print money. And you know, printing money is an inflationary tax. You see, from 2019 to now, our money base has increased by, the money supply has increased by 62%. That kind of explains why we have so much inflation. So this has to be sorted out.
But Talal, according to the former governor of the central bank, Ajit Nivad Cabral, money printing doesn't really increase inflation. I think he cited the example of the US and said that the US Federal Reserve prints trillions of dollars almost every year, and their inflation isn't that bad.
Right. So first of all, we have to admit that, I don't want to say this, but that is not entirely true. I mean, I would even say nonsense. Because, you see, yeah, I agree. The US can print, because what the former governor does not understand or forgot to realize is that the US is the reserve currency of the world. So they can print. So they are in demand. Like if you see over 60% of reserves in central banks around the world. I'm not talking about just the US, whole dollars. So their currency is in demand. So we can't do that. Similarly, there's another argument that Japan has over 200% of GDP debt. But Japan has debt in Japanese yen, where they can print it out. And also Japan's net assets is positive. So the amount of investments they have outside the country is more positive, larger than their debt. So these are factors. So we always like to compare with the, I mean, you can't compare. No country in the world can compare to the US, because through the decades, using their financial power, they have made their currency the reserve currency. So it's always going to be in demand. So that is, yeah. But of course, we've all been taught, even in primary school, that, you know, printing money. So if there is 100 products and 100 rupees, it's going to be 1 rupee. But if you have 100 products and if you have 200 rupees, obviously you don't have to be an expert to understand that the price is going to increase.
So Talal, on the independence of the central bank, what we were discussing before, how will things change? What will change in the processes, in the administration, generally? Of course, we can't go in detail into every aspect, but generally, some changes that would really, really affect the monetary policy, affect the economic stability of Sri Lanka. What will change come the Central Bank Act? So,
I feel that with that, one of the things is the IMF has disallowed monetary money printing. So this means that the Treasury will have to somehow balance it. So I feel there will be better discipline. So this can also be a thing for SOEs. So they will have to get their act together. So it is, overall, it's going to have a positive effect. I mean, of course, we may run into trouble if a crisis comes. But then otherwise, because there were some interesting stats I was sharing on Twitter as well. Like, for example, if you look at SOE losses in 2021, it was 4% of GDP.
Right.
So if you look at the social safety net, it's the guaranteed one, at least the flow on the IMF is 0.6. So for 2021, for that you could have increased social safety net by 7 times. So that's the amount of losses we make. So even Sri Lankan Airlines, the amount of losses they make, I mean, the total losses of SOEs, I mean, you can almost double the education and health budget. So we are badly, so it kind of, I feel it will affect everything in a sort of a positive way. Of course, it's going to be very tough. I mean, some of the conditions that have been put by the IMF are very challenging. Like, for example, we are supposed to go from 8% or 7.3% government revenue to GDP to around 14%. So that's a steep one. And also primary budget deficit of, that is without the interest components, we are at minus 3.8. So trying to become 2.3 is like
that's a very ambitious target.
Ambitious target. It's going to be a lot of belt tightening. But sometimes if you want to get well, you have to take the hard pills. And as I said, we have been having a fiscal deficit. That means spending more than we earn for 75 years. So that means we've basically, in layman's word, it's we've lived beyond our means. So sometimes, like for our grandparents, parents, and us, it's time for me or my child to pay for it. Somebody has to pay for something. But hopefully, when these are done, we can move forward as a nation. Because when we are in minus and we struggle so much, as we get to zero, we're obviously going to be moving much faster. At least
Definitely, Talal. Of course, once you've hit rock bottom, there is nowhere to go but up. We will cross over to a short commercial break, and on the other side, continue our discussion on the autonomy of the central bank, and also something that has not quite made it to the headlines here in Sri Lanka, the efforts of various other countries in the world to de-dollarize. How will this affect Sri Lanka's economic stability and our agreement with the IMF? We'll bring you details of that and more after this short commercial break.
Newsfirst, Newsline.
Sri Lanka open to consider debt for nature swap to overcome crisis. 5 million rupees goes missing from central bank safe. Police investigation underway. University teachers decide to call off strike and return to work. However, will not engage in papermarking. Futa says they will not tolerate the government's failure to address the legitimate demands. Sri Lankans ready to welcome Sinhala and Tamil New Year. However, concerns mount over a business mafia. Special task force deployed to track concealed stocks of eggs. Sri Lanka announces squad for first test against Ireland in Galle.
Newsfirst, Newsline.
Hello there, welcome back. You're watching Newsline. We're in discussion with Talal Rafi, an economist. We were speaking about the autonomy that is to be awarded to the central bank via the new Central Bank Act. Talal, how does this really change the way the central bank operates? You said there has been, Sri Lanka has been irresponsible in their spending. Our fiscal discipline has been very, very bad for over 70 years. So this new Central Bank Act, is it a panacea for all ills? How does it change?
So as far as I'm concerned, in my opinion, one of the most important reforms would be the independence of the central bank. As I explained before, it leads to financial discipline. So, for example, the central bank is already sort of much independent when compared to some of the other countries. But the only one area I would like to state is that the Treasury Secretary sits on the Monetary Board. So that means since we got rid of the permanent secretaries, so nowadays the Secretary is mostly controlled by the minister. So it's the government playing its hand with things. So there are many examples. Like one is a very famous example is the US. For example, there was a speaker talking about the US. But I also want to state that the United States President appoints the chair of the Federal Reserve. So it's not some independent organization. So what was I trying to say? So the example was in 1971. Like this happened in a developed country. So President Nixon tried to influence the
Federal
Fed
Reserve.
chair, to keep rates low. Or keep it as it is, because he wanted to win the elections in 72. So this resulted in a decade of inflation in the US, and which spread around the world. So that is like the politician, because you see in a democracy, especially when you don't have independence of the central bank, it's very easy for the ruling party to play around, because decrease interest rates, print money, and help out your supporters.
Give fuel subsidies.
Fuel subsidies, yes. So if this can be curtailed, it's going to benefit a lot, because many politicians would not like the independence of the central bank because of this. And as I gave an example outside the country, President Nixon is an example. And if you compare it to central banks around the world, like for example, Germany. Germany has one of the most independent central banks, because in the 1920s, after they lost the First World War, they had very bad experience with inflation. The Weimar Republic, something like Zimbabwe, where they had to carry printed notes in a cart. So that kind of, like I was talking to a German economist, they were saying the German mindset was sort of influenced by that. So never to go back into inflation. And if you see during the 1970s, if you compare even developed countries, when the US had high inflation, you see Germany and other certain Scandinavian countries had low inflation. So that kind of explains this. Because also this central bank act the IMF is pushing will keep the primary thing as controlling inflation. The secondary priority would be financial stability. You see, in other countries, even in the US, it's the central bank's job to sort of stimulate the economy. And that always kind of explains why there is always a boom and a bust. You let out money, things go up, then inflation comes on, you have to control it. So if you see, the central bank is the owner of money. So we all have our rupees. So it's its duty to keep it safe, because look at what happened because of the printing of money. How many people have saved their money and it's lost? I mean, look at domestic debt restructuring. I say we shouldn't do it, but so much of, you see, 90% of, or over 80% of EPF and ETF are exposed to domestic debt by the treasury bills and bonds. So how much of it has already been lost because of inflation? Our rupee value has deteriorated drastically. So it does not incentivize any person to save. Like if you look at sort of Lebanon and other countries, because they had consistent inflation, it also explains why people there spend more. So there is less saving because people don't see a
point in saving.
And also I want to speak, because of our fiscal deficit and money printing, we have had consistently high inflation rate when compared to the rest of the region. So when inflation rate is at around 6%, to have real interest rates, you have to have it at 10%. So what does that mean? Like when you have consistent, let's say, for example, we have inflation rate at 7%. So if the bank is going to lend and have a profit to have real interest rates, it has to add on to the inflation.
Yes.
So borrowing costs naturally become harder. So our industries are naturally unable to compete with countries which have lower inflation and therefore lesser interest rates, so lesser borrowing costs. So that's what many argue, that this would be the core, at least in my opinion, the first step to put things right.
Right. But also, Talal, let's get into some questions posed by a few of our viewers. Of course, this is coming in also from one of our viewers. You spoke about debt reprofiling. You said that Sri Lanka needs to go into debt reprofiling if we are to revive our economy to a certain degree, at least given the economic crisis that we're facing right now. Yeah. But debt reprofiling versus other options that Sri Lanka has. Have we really considered all of them? Because from the get-go, once the economic crisis hit, everybody said IMF, debt reprofiling. What are the other options that we really have?
So are you referring to external or internal?
External and internal.
Right. External, of course, we don't have much of a choice because it's in dollars and it's gone beyond our control. So the IMF, to be very fair, 2 years ago itself, the notes were coming that our debt was unsustainable. So if we had gone...
Rating agencies dropped our rating.
So if we had gone to the IMF back in March 2020, we would have had reserves of over $5 billion.
Right.
In our hand and gone to the IMF in a, as many politicians say, in a much stronger way. So there are many of these politicians who are saying we should go to the IMF in a strong way, who were with the government in 2019 to 2021. So they should have told that to the president back then, which they didn't. So that is one thing. So obviously we need the IMF to restructure the external debt. As far as domestic goes, that is a tough one because already banks are in distress because you see, when you look at Ireland, Ireland had a banking crisis which led to an economic crisis. And their banking crisis started when the non-performing loans went into double digits, over 10%. But when you look at our banks, our non-performing loans are at 12%. So we are like hitting the mark. And according to the IMF report, 33% of debt is given out by banks is in stress. So people are unable to pay, obviously, with the high
economic crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yes.
Many reasons.
Yeah, many reasons. So on one end, it's tough. But at the same time, you see, there has to be some sort of restructuring. Because you see, half of the debt is external, which is going to be reprofiled or in some other way. But out of that, 1/3 is to the multilaterals, so that is not going to be touched. So only 2/3 of the 50%, that's 1/3 is going to be restructured. So if nothing from the domestic is touched, it's going to be very tough on the ISB holders and the bilaterals to somehow bring it into balance.
And there has to be a certain sense of fairness.
Yes, fairness.
That everybody is taking some form of a hit.
Yes. So, so right now what has happened is the central bank has said that only its T-bills will be this thing. And as far as the bonds go, it's supposed to be a voluntary thing, which I think they will we'll have to see how it's negotiated. But at the same time, I feel that the truth is domestic debt restructuring would be a bit of a tough place to go in. So it's very, very carefully handled. We have to really keep slightly pushing it until we know that it won't cause instability. Even the ISB bondholders in their letter a few months ago, they mentioned that though they want domestic debt restructuring, they don't want to cause financial instability.
Right. Talal, one final question. I couldn't quite allocate enough time on this program for an in-depth discussion of this. We've got about 3 minutes left. De-dollarization. It's been widely spoken of in international media. We, being stuck with our economic crisis, haven't had much time to look into it. But de-dollarization basically is the fact that Saudi Arabia, many other countries, China, Russia, they are ditching the dollar and dealing in their own currency. Even India is doing that now with Sri Lanka. How is this going to really affect Sri Lanka in the long run? You know, given the fact that a lot of Sri Lanka's debt is in dollars, is this good for us, bad for us?
So that is a question for a long discussion. But in the short term, I feel for our immediate needs, that could be a positive, because I think we are starting to trade with India as well. But as far as speaking on a global scale, I feel like recently there is this talk about the BRICS having their own currency. One thing has to be stated is that the dollar is a very strong institution built on, a strong currency built over decades. So 60% of reserves in central banks, not just in the US, but around the world, have reserves as the US dollar. In second place comes the euro with 20%. The yuan comes still at 2%. So 60 to 2, I mean, it's a long way to go. But it's you see, the currency, the issue is it's fiat money. So it's basically worthless. It's the value we would put on it. So it's still based on trust. So in my opinion, I see obviously there is going to be a decline in the dollar over the years, gradually maybe, but things can always change, you know. We live in a world where everything is unpredicted. So there can be this thing, but as far as I'm concerned, for now, it would be the dominant thing, because as far as Sri Lanka goes, we need dollars because our debt is
in dollars.
In dollars. So we need even petrol. I mean, Saudi hasn't really moved away from it, like even oil. Most of it you have to pay in
Just
dollars.
for trading with China, they're using the yuan.
Yeah, yuan, yes.
But not with other countries. They're still paying in dollars.
Yes, right.
So that's, of course, all the time we've got on Newsline today. A very interesting discussion. Of course, we will have you once again on our show to discuss many more of these matters affecting Sri Lanka's economy, because that has been a topic that has been widely discussed here in Sri Lanka because of the situation that we're in. And it always helps to be informed about what's happening in the economic sphere here in Sri Lanka. Thank you very much, Talal Rafi, economist at the Deloitte Economics Institute, for joining us on our program. Thank you very much to all our viewers for tuning in. Until we meet again, take care and God bless.